thanks for tuning in today. You're watching Equa Connection with me, Claire Brady. Today I'm here with Mr. Morasco. He's a science teacher here at Equa Valley. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
So could you explain what got you interested in sustainable farming methods?
Well, I think the biggest draw to sustainable agriculture was the sustainable piece in itself. I've always been drawn to things that I know can last, that don't rely on outside sources, that can be sustainable in lots of different situations. So that's what drew me to sustainable agriculture, because specifically with agriculture, I see that as has a key role in terms of improving a lot of aspects of some of the problems we find in society. For example, social injustice. Not everybody has access to wholesome, good food. Environmental issues. The way that we grow food also has a huge impact on the environment. And then human health. A lot of the food that we consume is really no good for us. And in the process of making it, it's not good for the environment either. So I see sustainable agriculture as being a solution to a lot of the problems that we're facing on the human health front, the environmental front, and the social injustice aspect.
So what do you think that the main issue with traditional farming techniques is? Like, how is it endangering us as humans and the earth as a whole?
So I think that with traditional versus sustainable, I think first we need to kind of frame that and say, okay, so what is a traditional farm? What does it look like now? What does it look like 50 plus years ago? And 50 plus years ago, the average size farm was much smaller. The crops that they grew were a lot more diverse. They weren't putting pesticides and herbicides on their food, consequently in the soils, consequently in the watersheds, in the rivers, and the streams. And so we didn't have as much of a domino effect on the environment from farms in the traditional sense 50 years ago as we do now. The farms today are, and I'll specifically talk about mega farms, these huge farms that really have become super efficient at only growing a couple crops. So maybe it's corn, maybe it's soy, but the diversity on the farm is way down. A lot of the food that we grow in these mega-style farms isn't even for people, it's for livestock or ethanol for energy purposes. So that's taking away from arable land that we could be growing actual food for people. But we're actually encouraging these farmers to grow one crop, monoculture, low diversity. We're encouraging them to spray herbicides, pesticides on a mass scale. And we're encouraging them to use this land to grow food for animals, not us, and for fuel for our vehicles. So it takes away it erodes away at our ability to grow wholesome, good, healthy food. And the farms that are large enough to supply like these mega corporations, like say McDonald's or something like that, with food, they have to be growing on a mass scale, which when you get to that level, it almost requires you, if I want to have one supplier of apples, I need to have that one supplier provide a tremendous amount of apples. If I'm like a big, giant like McDonald's, which means that person is going to be they're not going to be growing those apples in a sustainable fashion. They're going to be spraying the pesticides, herbicides. They're going to be bringing in fossil fuel-based fertilizers. And nothing of what they're doing is sustainable at all, and there's lots of domino effects on the surrounding environment. And I think that's the fundamental difference between sustainable ag and traditional kind of mega farm ag, is that sustainable ag is usually smaller, more localized, and there's way more of a consideration put on human health, right? So who's going to be consuming the product that we're growing, and in the process of growing the food, what is going to be, in terms of the environment, decrease in terms of quality. So those are the big factors, right? So small local sustainable ag has consideration for human health and the health of the environment, whereas traditional big ag doesn't anymore. It did more so 50 plus years ago. So.
Okay, what's something that the average consumer nowadays could do to promote sustainable agriculture?
Well, that's actually really simple, and they can shop local sustainable products, because if you're supporting the local small guy and you're not giving your money to these big corporations that are doing it in a way, growing your food in a way that you don't necessarily agree with, then that's less money into that big company's pocket. And if more and more people do that, that turns into a lot of money that's not going into their pocket, and that'll force them to make changes to grow food in a way that aligns with your worldview and what you want to see happen. So that would be the most impacting way,
Okay.
to kind of your voting every time you make a purchase.
All right. So you're obviously a big promoter of the sustainable farming techniques. What's something that you're doing? I know that you're interested in aquaponics and starting to make your own systems.
So I've kind of designed my own little aquaponics system that can just be in a classroom.
Quickly, could you define what aquaponics is?
Absolutely. So aquaponics is the merging of like two typically independent systems. Hydroponics, which is soilless growing, which is growing plants in water, basically. And aquaculture, which is you're farming fish. And they both independently are not sustainable on their own. They can't stand on their own, but when you merge them together, the fish actually produce waste. And then there's a third phase in that aquaponics, which is the bacteria. And bacteria is like the horsepower of the system. It will essentially convert the waste, which is ammonia from fish, and it'll turn it into ultimately nitrate. And nitrate is like Miracle-Gro. So if you were to go to the store, you'd spend a lot of money on basically nitrate, to put on your garden or flowers or what have you. Well, in an aquaponics, it's basically just a cycle where the fish waste is converted into fertilizer, and then the plants are able to grow through the fertilizer that was produced in the system. So really, essentially, you put one input in, you feed the fish, and you get two outputs. You get plants, and then you can harvest fish, right, to eat. In our classroom systems, we're not harvesting the fish. We're just using, fun little tropical fish. But in a commercial size system, you absolutely could have tilapia or whatever other type of fish that you want to raise and harvest. So you feed the fish, and you end up with plants, vegetables, an entire meal.
So aquaponics could be created on like a larger scale, not just within a classroom setting. Like they could be used to do commercially as like a different sort of farming, correct?
Absolutely, and that's really taking off actually right now, because there are a tremendous amount of abandoned warehouses, old factories that basically don't have a lot of value, and these aquaponic businesses can move right into these abandoned warehouses in the middle of cities, right near where there are a tremendous amount of restaurants and population density of people who would need to eat the food. So you're growing it locally in an area that is affordable in terms of, like, if I'm a business, if I'm an entrepreneur, I can go in and rent that space for cheap or purchase a building that nobody else basically wants. And you can add a lot of value to that building and produce a tremendous amount of food on a small footprint right in the middle of an urban environment. And you don't need the typical sprawling, farm fields and everything else where the food would then have to travel a lot of distances. So you absolutely could scale the exact same little tiny system that we have in the classroom. You can scale that up to a commercial size.
Great.
And produce a lot of food.
And just one last thing, why don't we use sustainable methods more often in our farming system?
That's a good question. So I think that one of the reasons we don't use sustainable methods is because the investment up front, I think, is a little bit larger sometimes. Like, for example, aquaponics, extremely sustainable, way more efficient. Its productivity is huge. However, for a commercially sized system, you might end up spending to grow that amount of food maybe 7-8 times the amount that you would spend if you were going to grow that food on a field. So it costs more money up front to be more sustainable in a lot of cases, not all cases. So I think on a commercial scale, that's one factor. But long term, it's more profitable, and you're going to make more money as a business owner and grow more healthy organic food the sustainable way. However, most people will get into business, and because there are so many requirements through the FDA and everything else where everything has to be just perfect to grow on a commercial scale and to deal with those type of numbers with food, the easiest way to do it is to apply herbicides, is to apply pesticides. It is to, increase your density of what you're growing on land by using fossil fuel-based fertilizers. So you're not relying on nature. You're essentially recreating everything, and you take your own inputs and you have your own outputs, but now you have waste, and that's typically cheaper to do from the get-go. The other major thing is subsidies. Subsidies is where the federal government or state, local will take money and they will encourage farmers or whoever to either grow something or do it in a certain way. And the subsidies are heavily slanted towards commercial farming. So the commercial farmers will get subsidies from the federal government to grow that way, not sustainably. So right now it's really not an even playing field, right? So.
Understandable. All right, thanks so much for coming in. For the connection, I'm Brady. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Have a nice day.